It's pretty wild when you think about it. We live in a world where artificial intelligence can write a beautiful, moving poem or generate a photorealistic image in literally seconds. Yet, if you ask a robot to reliably fold a t shirt without turning it into a crumpled mess or empty a dishwasher without shattering your favorite mug, yeah, suddenly we're completely stuck. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating new framework for physical intelligence. We are going to figure out exactly why robotics hasn't scaled anywhere near as rapidly as text or image AI, and more importantly, what the missing pieces actually are. To really grasp where we're at right now, there's this fantastic quote from the paper we're unpacking today. Robotics is entering its foundation model moment, but it does not yet have its internet. I mean, just think about that for a second. We've got these massive, incredibly powerful vision language action models, what we call VLAs, and they are incredibly hungry for data, but they're essentially starving. They just don't have that vast, interconnected web of knowledge that our text models can effortlessly tap into. All right, let's jump right into section one, the curated textbook limit. So, I want you to imagine a student trying to learn everything about the world. The current state of robotics, which is often called the robot native regime, is basically like forcing that student to learn from a single, heavily curated textbook. Sure, the data in there is incredibly clean, and it's perfectly mapped out to a robot's specific joint angles and motors, but man, it is limited, and producing it is outrageously expensive. Meanwhile, just outside the window, there is the unstructured physical world. It's an infinite library, a vast ocean of human YouTube videos, factory workflows, everyday physical interactions. It literally contains all the knowledge in the world. But here's the catch. For a robot, all those books are written in a totally foreign language. It's completely untranslated. Relying solely on that one curated textbook creates some massive bottlenecks for us. First off, robot native data requires very specific hardware coordinates. So if you collect data on a robot with a simple parallel gripper, you can't just easily translate that to a robot with a multi-fingered hand. It doesn't work. Second, every single time you try to collect new data to expand this tiny dataset, every failure risks real physical damage to the hardware or the environment. It is just highly rigid. We're basically trying to build general artificial intelligence using a microscopic fraction of the world's actual physical data. Which brings us right to section two, the unreadable data library. Now, you might be wondering, why can't we just force a robot to binge watch YouTube tutorials to learn? Well, the answer is something called the embodiment gap. Basically, this is a kinematic and dynamic mismatch between the source of the data, say a human hand slicing an onion in a cooking video, and the target trying to execute it, like a mechanical robot gripper. Think about it. Human hands have soft tissue, complex joints, tactile skin. A robot, it might literally just have two metal pincers. They absolutely do not share the same coordinate system, which makes direct imitation practically impossible. The library is full of knowledge, sure, but it is completely unreadable to the robot. And that leads us to our main guiding question for today. How do we actually build a translation matrix for the physical world? If we want our robots to break out of their curated textbook and finally read from that infinite library of human experience, we desperately need a mathematical and physical translation layer. We need a way to map the messy, high-dimensional reality of human movement into the very rigid, specific coordinate space of a machine. That perfectly sets up section three, the four grounding pillars. All right, so the very first pillar here is the physical data engine. You can think of this as our super diligent librarian who is finally starting to decode the unreadable books. First, the engine ingests all this messy, asynchronous raw data, like, say, a cell phone video of someone making a cup of coffee. Second, it aligns all those visual inputs onto a single temporal event timeline. Third, it applies something called embodied auto-labeling. This means the system automatically detects when an object's state actually changes, like when the coffee cup is lifted and exactly when physical contact happens. And finally, it outputs structured supervision that a robot can actually digest and learn from. We are literally turning messy, unstructured human video into perfectly labeled physical events. But okay, once we know what happened in a video, how does the robot actually replicate it? Well, what's really interesting about this next concept is that we aren't just copying the human. Enter the second pillar, task-preserving retargeting. Because of that embodiment gap we talked about, we definitely don't want the robot trying to copy the human's exact pose. Instead, our translator decodes the physical effect on the world. If a human hand opens a drawer, the retargeting layer calculates how a mechanical gripper's specific coordinate space can achieve that exact same physical task, even if the robot's movement looks entirely different from the human's. Let's keep moving. Section 4, the embodiment gap and world models. Now, for a robot to act safely out there, it needs what we call a physics-grounded world model. I really want to contrast this with a generic video generator, like the ones you've probably seen creating wild AI art online. A generic generator just predicts visually plausible future pixels. It looks nice, but it doesn't know anything about reality. A robot's world model, on the other hand, absolutely must predict mass, friction, forces, and the actual consequences of contact. If a robot imagines pushing a heavy wooden block, it needs to know if that block will slide, if it'll tumble over, or if it's just too heavy to move at all. Visual realism just isn't enough here. We need true physical realism. So a true physics-grounded world model has to answer some pretty critical questions before the robot ever even twitches a motor. It has to ask, hey, is this proposed grasp actually stable? Or will the object slip, tumbling your freshly brewed coffee all over the floor? Is there force upon contact? Or if I pull this, will the cloth deform correctly, or will it tear? By answering these questions, our translation matrix allows the robot to safely imagine counterfactuals, basically trying out a bunch of different actions in its head before risking any real physical hardware in the messy real world. On to Section 5, closing the learning loop. Okay, so we've translated the data, we've retargeted the action, and we've simulated the physics. What's left? The fourth and final pillar is self-improving deployment loops. Look, the translation matrix isn't going to be perfect right out of the gate, and the robot is definitely going to make mistakes. But here's the kicker. A failed rollout isn't just a bad trajectory or a crash. It is incredibly high-value, structured supervision. If we can convert every real-world rollout, every single success, failure, and human correction into task-conditioned reward grounding, the robot learns. A failed attempt to grasp a cup tells the matrix exactly what part of the coordinate translation needs fixing. It basically allows our translation dictionary to continuously autocorrect itself. Let's break down exactly how that compounding deployment loop plays out in practice. First, you deploy the policy and observe the physical outcome. Next, the system infers whether it was a success or a failure relative to the actual task it was trying to do. Then it routes that supervision straight back to the data engine we talked about in Pillar 1. And finally, it updates the entire translation stack and redeploys. This means that every single time the robot makes a move, the entire translation dictionary gets a little bit smarter and a little bit more accurate. And that brings us to Section 6, the translation matrix assembled. So the crucial point here is how all these pieces come together to form our final translation matrix and bridge that embodiment gap. The physical data engine infers exactly what happened from the messy human data. Then, task-preserving retargeting proposes how a specific robot can actually reproduce that physical effect. After that, the physics-grounded world model predicts the physical consequences of that proposed action. And finally, the self-improving deployment loop interprets the success or failure of the move and updates the entire matrix. Together, these four pillars take that unreadable, infinite library of the physical world and transform it into a perfectly structured textbook that any robot can read and learn from. All of this leaves us with a truly fascinating possibility. We started this explainer by looking at why robotics was stuck in that rigid, curated textbook phase. But with this translation matrix fully assembled, those limits completely fall away. If a robot can suddenly read the unreadable library, if it can actually learn from every single human video and physical interaction ever recorded on the internet, what task will it master first? Think about that for a bit. It really changes the game. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.